My name's Nikolas Rose. I'm a professor of sociology at King's College London. I'm head of the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, and I'm also involved in the Human Brain Project in the Society and Ethics sub-project, where I am the director of one of the work packages which is responsible for Foresight, the so-called Foresight Lab that's based here at King's College London. And what I want to talk today about is particularly responsible research as it is being applied in the big brain projects. The big brain projects which try to scale up neuroscience. And I'll say a little bit about what I mean by those big brain projects in a moment. Now, there are many questions that one might raise about big science in democratic societies. By big science, I mean the very heavily funded projects like the Human Brain Project, like its predecessor, the Human Genome Project. These are projects which have major investment over long periods of time in the service of grand social objectives. One might ask general questions about the relationship between science and democracy and the extent of democratic choice that's involved in selecting projects to receive such funding. One might ask about democratic science, and is it ever possible for science, which is in many ways an elitist activity requiring esoteric knowledge, is it ever possible for that to be, quote, democratized? One might ask questions about open science and open data, which is a big push within the European Commission at the moment. One might ask about the obligations of scientific experts in wider democratic debates about, say, the future of transport policy or the future of military policy. One can think of many, many examples where scientists would have and do have something very important to say. One might ask questions about how you can create a scientific citizenry. That is to say, how can you really ensure that the citizens in a democratic society do have the literacy to be able to understand, to evaluate, and to engage in scientific debates? And this was a concern certainly in the United Kingdom going back to the radical scientists like Bernal in the 1930s. These are all crucial questions, but I'm not going to talk about them here. What I want to talk about specifically is the question of responsible research and innovation in the big brain projects. Now, Neuron recently had a very useful collection of articles around these big brain projects, because there are big public investments in neuroscientific research in a number of countries. There is, in the European Union, there is the Human Brain Project, which at least initially had its focus on simulation, on modeling, and on neuroinformatics. Now wishes to become a kind of platform and infrastructure resource for European neuroscience. In the United States, there is the so-called BRAIN initiative, brain research through advancing innovative neurotechnologies. Their focus is on neural circuits using novel technologies such as optogenetics. I believe that the funding which is anticipated for the USA's BRAIN initiative is something like $4.8 billion. In Australia, there's an Australian Brain Alliance, which claims to focus on, quotes, cracking the brain's code, has a focus on brain disease and also on learning. There's a Chinese brain project led by a neuroscientist who works both in China and in the United States, Muming Pu, and which argues that the specific advantage, or at least one specific advantage of doing this neuroscientific research in China would be the ability to use non-human primates, and in particular transgenic models in non-human primates. There's a Japanese brain project which focuses on mapping the marmoset brain and again creating transgenic lines for the study of brain diseases. And there are many more in Canada, in Korea, and in Cuba. So something is happening. These have all developed in the last decade, in the second decade of the 21st century. Something is happening to bring the focus of the funders, both public funders, non-governmental organizations and others, to bring the focus of the funders to the brain. What is that? Well, of course there are many differences between these different brain projects, but they do share something of a vision. First of all, they share the belief that now is the time to, quote, scale up neuroscience. The term neuroscience, which slips very easily off the tongue right now, was actually invented in 1962 by Francis O. Schmidt at MIT as part of what he called the Neuroscience Research Project, which was an early attempt and a foundational attempt to bring together researchers working on the brain in all sorts of different disciplines into a shared collective project called neuroscience. 50 years after the invention of the term neuroscience, the argument is it's time to scale up, by which I think is meant link together the research of the hundreds and thousands of neuroscientists in the hundreds of labs across any particular country, scattered, perhaps each doing their own thing, working with their own animals, working with their own experimental paradigms, working with their own particular strategies on their own particular problems, to link those together in order to generate an understanding of the brain. And perhaps this is most clearly illustrated in the words of Francis Collins, who is the director of the National Institutes of Health in the United States, and also, as many people will know, had a very large role in the Human Genome Project. And this is what Francis Collins said about the US Brain Project. The hope, he said, is that this project will reveal how the brain's roughly 86 billion neurons and its trillions of connections interact in real time and revolutionize our understanding of how we think, feel, learn, and remember, close quotes. And he referred to this as a moonshot for our generation, launching America's next moonshot. Something as ambitious and paradigm changing as the space race. But the second thing that Francis Collins argued in his account of what the hopes were underlying the US Brain Project also figures in many other brain projects. And that's the hope that, again, to quote him, that these projects will, quote, transform efforts to help the more than 1 billion people worldwide who suffer from autism, depression, schizophrenia, epilepsy, traumatic brain injury, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and other devastating brain disorders, close quotes. So here, there is the suggestion that our societies do face a grand challenge. That grand challenge is a range of disorders, psychiatric disorders, neurodegenerative disorders, neurological disorders, and that these disorders can be understood, will be understood, and that we will be better able to intervene in them, to mitigate them, to cure them, perhaps even to prevent them, on the basis of this kind of research which will understand the brain at this molecular neurobiological level. So the emphasis here in these projects that, as I said, are heavily funded by public agencies as well as by various private agencies, is on the medical, the economic, and indeed the military importance of scientific research. And this isn't new, but it does have a particular character today. Because you may say that the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb was motivated by the desire for military supremacy. And you may say that the Apollo projects, the space race projects, were motivated by competition for scientific prestige between the United States and the Soviet Union, although of course they had other motivations. But here we see science is to be placed in the service of social and economic and medical objectives, and that in each of these projects there is a direct link between the public funding of research and innovation and social objectives in a rather short time frame, because these are hopes that we might develop at least some of these innovations in something like 2020, in 5 or 10 years. And the belief is also that this is related to creating an economy in those societies with these scientific resources, an economy based on knowledge and innovation, which of course itself is based on a certain political and economic analysis of the consequences of globalization, that no longer can these advanced industrial societies maintain their standards of living, their economic well-being, their growth, based on the old industries, the old metal bashing and industrial industries. Our new industries must be based on knowledge. We must become a knowledge economy based on innovation. The brain research is part of that desire to become a knowledge economy based on research and innovation. And this inescapably creates expectations on scientists and science itself, and on the translatable results of scientific research. Now, the Human Brain Project, the US Brain Project, and the Canadian project, and maybe some of the others, but certainly those three, have specific funds set aside for ethical and social investigations, responsible research and innovation. And I think that responsible research and innovation is intrinsically linked to these large claims that are being made. Because if these large claims are being made, it is legitimate, I think, and it's become imperative for the research funders to try and identify whether or not those large claims are actually going to be achieved. The scientific challenge, your brain, the final frontier. Will these large investments in bringing together neurobiological research actually lead to a step change in our understanding of the human brain? The ICT challenge, are we going to be able to develop computers that emulate or simulate human brains, simulate the speed of computation in human brains, simulate the flexibility of human brains in multiple conditions of uncertainty to come very rapidly to decisions, emulate the energy characteristics of the human brain, which requires so little energy to manage its computations compared to any computer that we have available to us at the moment, and indeed emulate what we might want to term intelligence. So that's the ICT challenge. There's also this claim that is, I think, fundamental to most, if not all, of the brain projects, that this is the way to invest our money to meet the challenge of, quotes, the burden of brain disorders, the costs of brain disorders, not just on individuals, not just on families, but on economies, that by a knowledge of the brain we'll build a capacity to diagnose objectively these disorders, which are now increasingly being called brain disorders rather than mental disorders, to transform psychiatry by basing it on neurobiology, that we'll be able to find brain-based therapies, not just drug targets, but perhaps other ways of intervening in the brain in order to mitigate some of those disorders, that we'll be able to find brain-based preventive interventions to stop some of these disorders developing in the first place, and that we'll be able to avoid or to move beyond the one-size-fits-all approach of many psychiatric interventions, especially psychiatric drugs, to so-called personalize or make precise our medical interventions. All of this is linked on the belief that these developments will translate. that they will create social and economic benefits, but how can we be assured that we will indeed achieve these impacts, and how can we retain public trust in these developments? That is in part the role of RRI, Responsible Research and Innovation. I want to illustrate this by looking at some detail at the work that we're doing in the Ethics and Society sub-project of the European Commission's Human Brain Project. And not because I think this is completely without problems, but it's certainly, as far as I'm aware, the most comprehensive attempt to introduce ethical and social reflection into a big brain project. We have mapped our work in our Ethics and Society sub-project onto the AREA approach developed in the UK by the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council: anticipation, reflection, engagement, and action. And indeed, we have parts of our work which are split up, work packages, to use the common phrase, which are split up to do all those different aspects. Anticipation is the work of the Foresight Lab, which I direct at King's College London. And the Foresight Lab attempts to identify potential ethical and social concerns at an early stage, often by producing scenarios of developments and their implications, to feed those back into the HBP to help build capacity to respond to uncertain futures. Reflection. How can people reflect? How can one build analysis and reflection into the work of researchers? Well, the reflection package performs ethical and social analyses of key dimensions of the Human Brain Project, for instance, questions of simulation, for instance, questions of consciousness, and tries to contribute not just to conceptual clarification, but also to feed back those reflections and to feed back the work of anticipation from the Foresight Lab into the researchers in the Human Brain Project itself, to build and support reflective capacity of the researchers and others to address social implications. Engagement, that's a key part of RRI. Work here is largely done by the Danish Board of Technology Foundation. That involves setting up citizens' juries and other forms of citizen consultation across Europe, because the HBP is conducted in many different European countries across Europe, so that's a big challenge because there are many different publics in many different European countries to try and bring in the results of the HBP, to bring those to stakeholders, to bring those into dialogue at a very early stage. And action, that is the endeavor to bring some of these back to the directors and researchers and those responsible within those brain projects to help them build those analyses into decisions that they're making all the time about the direction of the project, to modulate the project in the light of this kind of feedback from the Ethics and Society sub-project, which is, of course, not the only way in which projects will be modulated. There are many other things, including the results of the scientific research itself. Let me say a little bit about the work of the Foresight Lab. Now, foresight is not forecasting. Forecasting tries to work by identifying what is the likely future of a particular development. But foresight is not forecasting. Foresight involves considering a whole range of plausible scenarios and using those plausible scenarios, even those that are relatively unlikely, to inform debate in the present. And this little Foresight future cone that is on the slide here indicates how it's done, by trying to think of what are the most unlikely, the most likely, the possible, the plausible, and the probable outcomes, and beginning to think about what implications might there be if some of these took place. Beginning to think often by creating plausible scenarios of what a world would look like, what the responsibility of the researchers might be, what the implications might be for government, for individuals, for corporations, so forth, if a particular set of eventualities occurred. So to produce these scenarios, to identify the consequences of these in each of these scenarios, to feed those back to the researchers in order to help the researchers themselves build their capacity for ethical reflection and informed decision making. It's important to stress here that, of course, we see an awful lot of things that sound a little bit like foresight. We're not short of speculations in the world in which we live, speculations about robots, about artificial machines, artificial intelligence, about machine learning, etc., etc., etc. And many of those speculations are based on very little evidence. But our endeavor here in the Foresight Lab is to have evidence-based, empirically grounded approaches to mapping out these future scenarios. We do it by expert interviews, we do it by workshops, we do it by scoping reports, we do it by socio-political analyses. And as I say, the aim is to feed that back into the project to help it shape the directions in a way that will maximize benefits and minimize socially undesirable outcomes. Amongst other things, it involves an analysis of translational pathways beyond the linear image of bench to bedside, which often informs discussion of some of these developments. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but I'd like to give a couple of very specific examples about the work that we've done. Now, one concern in Europe and in many other countries is about data privacy, data protection and data privacy. And indeed, there have been very well publicized events which demonstrate that the data, especially data that we put into the internet or that we hold on computers, is exceptionally vulnerable to hacking, exceptionally vulnerable to others gaining access to that data and using it for purposes that would not be the purposes that the individuals had decided upon when they agreed to contribute their data. And one part of the work that we did in our Foresight Lab very early on was to consider some of the ways in which a big project like the Human Brain Project might respond to the challenges of data protection and data privacy. There are questions about legality, of course, and any attempt to gather together data and hold it in certain resources, hold it on computers, hold it on servers or whatever, is subject to a whole series of legal regulations. But it wasn't only the question of legality that concerned us, because if people are going to donate their data, in this particular case people through hospitals donating clinical data about their brain disorders, about their lifestyles, about their medical diagnoses and about the outcome of various kinds of treatment, if people are going to donate these data, they want to be assured not just that the data is going to be held legally, but that those who hold the data are going to be trustworthy. And trustworthiness is not simply a legal matter. We know that people largely make decisions not on the basis of whether they've signed a legal document or whether they've read all the terms and conditions. We know that nobody reads the terms and conditions when they download a bit of software, or very few people ever read those 36 pages of tiny type about the terms and conditions. No, do you click I accept because you've read the terms and conditions? Or do you click I accept because you trust the people who you are giving access to your data? Again, in hospitals, we know that every individual who goes into an operation or who consents to give a part of their give blood or give a genetic sample or give a tissue sample for future research is consenting. Do they consent because they've read all the terms and conditions? No, the evidence suggests that they consent when and only when they trust their doctors, they trust the medical establishment, they trust the hospital. So trustworthiness is much more than a legal matter. Of course, there are many technical fixes to hold data in a protected way to ensure privacy. Anonymization according to various kinds of standards, and information security architecture. Those are all very, very important. But those, like the law, we discovered, through our research and the research of others, those do not guarantee trustworthiness. Trust is hard to gain, but very, very, very easy to lose. And if you want to gain trustworthiness, you've got to go a lot beyond the technical and a lot beyond the legal. First of all, of course, if it's a matter of personal data, there is the necessity of informed consent. Although the question about whether informed consent is sufficient is becoming a very complicated one, especially in a world where people consent, knowingly or unknowingly, to put a huge amount of their personal data, their Google searches or whatever it happens to be, up on the internet. Do they consent or do they not consent? Do our regimes of informed consent operate in this new online world? That's a difficult question, which we are looking at along with a lot of other people. But there are some ways of trying to make an apparatus for managing data more trustworthy. And we made a number of recommendations, a data governance committee, a privacy impact assessment, but more crucially for us, involving the patients groups, involving the patients themselves and their representatives in the process, to make them more than simply data subjects, to make them have an interest, an engagement and a concern with what this research might do and how it might bring them benefit. We produced a report, a Foresight report on that, and as a consequence of that Foresight report and other work, our social and ethical division, together with the ethics advisory board of the Human Brain Project, produced what we call an opinion on data protection and data privacy, something like the opinions that you see produced by national ethics councils across the world. One difference with our opinion is that our opinion was not just a statement of what was desired, but our opinion aimed to have traction on what actually happened within the Human Brain Project itself. So we developed our opinion, we collaborated with the Ethics Advisory Board. We also linked to something which again is, I think, unique or certainly unusual in the Human Brain Project, in that we have what we call ethical rapporteurs. The Human Brain Project is a very large distributed project involving dozens, over 100 laboratories, many, many, many different researchers. So it's very difficult for anybody to have an oversight of what's going on everywhere. We don't have the totalitarian eye that will tell us what's going on everywhere. So what we decided to do was to set up ethics rapporteurs in every sub-project. That is, researchers themselves, not ethicists, not social scientists, but researchers themselves who were aware of what was going on in their sub-project and who would bring their own ethical concerns to our ethics advisory board and to our steering committee of our social and ethical division, so that we would then have this way of engaging directly in a conversation across this very heterogeneous and distributed project. Of course, this was linked to the EU concerns about data privacy and protection of citizens, against identification, adverse consequences. That was going through the European Parliament at the time when we were developing this. But we wanted to go beyond that, again, as I say, to seek to develop trustworthiness. We made a number of recommendations in this opinion on data protection and privacy, a data governance working group, data audit, data policy manual, data protection officer, regular reviews, public engagement and transparency. And we're now seeking to implement those across the Human Brain Project itself. So this is an example, one small but important example of responsible research and innovation, how this differs from just general public engagement, how it differs from thinking about downstream implications, how it seeks to work in a kind of conversational, dialogic way with the researchers themselves and with other stakeholders in real time as the project is going along, and then how it seeks to reflect upon that, to anticipate, because we sought to anticipate some of the consequences if these data protection and privacy constraints were not applied, some of the consequences of lack of trustworthiness. And we have many examples of what happens when a data collection system begins to lose trustworthiness, and when citizens vote with their feet to withdraw from it or not to involve themselves in it. So this was evidence-based and an attempt in real time to modulate and transform this particular aspect of this project. An example, not the only example, of RRI in practice in a brain project. I've already mentioned another aspect of brain projects, key, which is the idea that if you understand the brain, if you can map the brain, in the case of the United States project, if you can understand the neural circuits, in the case of the Human Brain Project, if you can develop algorithms that cluster together neurobiological indicators of a disorder, you can develop an understanding of brain signatures, of neural signatures of a disorder that you can use to diagnose and treat. This belief that by identifying what's going on at the level of the brain, you will be able better, earlier, more accurately to diagnose, to treat, and perhaps to prevent. So we did another piece of foresight around these disease signatures. Now, what would happen if these disease signatures were recognized? If these neural signatures of psychiatric disorder were recognized? What were the technical issues? What were the social issues? What were the clinical issues? And what were the ethical issues? I won't go through the report that we did because it was quite a lengthy report, but it certainly identified a number of key challenges for those people who wanted to move in this direction. Of course, there were technical issues. Was it ever going to be possible to identify those relevant brain indicators, neural signatures, disordered circuits? Some of you may know that for about 30 years, there was a huge amount of work funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, but not just in the United States, but across the world, to find so-called biomarkers of psychiatric disorders at the cost of millions and millions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of person hours, many, many, many hundreds of studies of different disorders with taking genetic samples and doing brain scanning and so on and so forth. And it was hoped that this would be built in to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that the American Psychiatric Association was going to publish, the 5th edition of that, which was published in 2013. But despite 30 years of investment and research, when that manual was published, there was not a single clinically relevant biomarker for any psychiatric disorder. It had not proved possible to find the brain basis of psychiatric disorders. Now, of course, there are a number of ways of responding to this. The way that the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States is taking, and many researchers are taking. We need more research, we need better research, we need to throw away the classifications based on symptoms and find other classifications and so on and so forth. Another view is perhaps, well, actually there won't be those biomarkers for psychiatric disorders, and perhaps that's the wrong way to go. But suppose you did find anomalies in the brain that seemed probabilistically to be linked to a disorder. Would an anomaly in the brain be equivalent to a disease? Would it be legitimate to intervene on an individual who is not themselves suffering from a disorder or manifesting a disorder on the basis that you had found an anomaly in their brain? Is a disease signature, is a neural signature itself a disease? Since we know that human brains, like many other brains, differ hugely between individuals, was this a legitimate way of going forward? Would clinicians accept this? Would clinicians agree to diagnose not on the basis of symptoms, but on the basis of a brain scan or on the basis of a piece of genetic evidence? Would patients accept that was the best way to intervene, especially in the hope of some of these developments, to intervene pre-symptomatically, that's before the individual was ill, perhaps because they shared a marker with a family member who had themselves become ill? Would we be able to intervene on the basis of these brain signatures? Is it legitimate ever to treat a pre-disease, to treat a person who's just susceptible for a disease? We do this in other areas. Should we do this in psychiatry? Will psychiatric markers ever be reliable? Actually, we know that using other markers, for instance, the prostate-specific antigen test in the United States, which was used widely to intervene in breast cancer, or even screening of asymptomatic women over 45 for breast cancer, we know that many of the problems arise about pre-symptomatic intervention on the basis of biological markers. Are the same things going to occur if we try and develop these markers in the brain? And perhaps more fundamentally, are mental disorders brain disorders? Is that transformation to say, well, actually, it's all in the brain? Is that really a view that we need to accept, that we should accept? Is there sufficient evidence for it? So we try to raise some of these questions at an early stage and try and at least begin to get a debate going on. And this is a very widespread debate because, as I say, this search for disease signatures, for neurobiological signatures of psychiatric and other disorders is one of the big ambitions of the Brain Project. Well, we did a number of other things in our Foresight Lab. We looked at community building and we looked at ICT and robotics, but I'm not going to talk about those today. I just really want to focus upon one other issue that is beginning to emerge, and then maybe just give you a hint in the time that remains about some of the other things that we've looked at without going into them in any detail. Now, I've mentioned the funding of the brain projects, but not in any detail. And there is one very important distinction between the European Human Brain Project and the American Brain Initiative, and that's its relationship to military funding. The Human Brain Project, which is funded by the European Commission, because of its relationship to Europe, is explicitly forbidden from taking funding from military sources and explicitly forbidden for developing technologies which have a particular military application. The American Brain Project is funded around 40% by DARPA, the Defense and Allied Research Projects Agency, which is the research projects arm of the American military defense project. Of course, committed to defense, not to offense, if one can maintain that distinction. The HBP is committed to civil research only, and yet perhaps that is a comforting belief, but one that's difficult to sustain, because if you have an open data policy like something like the Human Brain Project certainly has, your research and your findings are going to go out into the public domain, and what happens to them is going to be difficult for you to control. So dual use, as it's conventionally called, dual use, which means, to put it briefly, the military use of technological developments which were primarily intended for civilian purposes, dual use remains a key issue. There are many dimensions of these brain projects that do have dual use implications. For instance, the possibility of memory modulation by neurotechnological intervention in the brain. More directly, monitoring, augmenting, and enhancing brain capacities, in particular by using cortical implants. Now, the US Brain Project, linked to DARPA, is certainly experimenting quite a lot with the use of cortical implants. Now, cortical implants are a classical dual-use technology. We have heard recently in our press about some amazing developments where a cortical implant connected wirelessly to the spine below a break can enable those people who have spinal cord injuries to move their lower limbs simply through thought alone. That is to say, not by directly operating on the musculature, but simply by thinking about moving a limb. That limb can be moved as long as you have an appropriate way of reading out the activity in certain regions of the motor cortex. Okay, so these are ways of reading out from brain capacities, and one can see all sorts of really crucial clinical uses for these increased capacities to read out from the brain, to read thoughts themselves in the brain. But one can also see, and these are being developed in certain military organizations, some of the problems of reading thoughts out in the brain. Of course, some security apparatuses have dreams of being able to read the thoughts of potential violent individuals, potential terrorists, those who might pose a threat. And some of those technologies, brain reading technologies, are themselves in development in the United States. Brain mind reading in counterterrorism may seem an extremely valuable part of military and defense resources, but it certainly raises ethical questions, because if you can read out from the brain, perhaps, just perhaps, you can also read into the brain. If you can read out signals from the brain, perhaps you can read signals back into the brain to modulate beliefs, to modulate intentions, to modulate desires. One can see a potential use of that, perhaps in people who have paedophilic impulses. Perhaps it would be possible to read out when an individual, perhaps coming close to a place where children are, is beginning to develop their paedophilic desires. And perhaps it's possible, without directly finding that person and locking them down or whatever, perhaps it would be possible to read back into the brain using certain technologies to mitigate, modulate, or reduce those desires. Perhaps we are moving to a situation in which in some ways it may be possible to control at least certain beliefs and feelings by neurotechnology, by cortical implants, or by other means. And we see this, of course, represented in many of our neuro movies that are so fascinating. We are already seeing the emergence of military drones, autonomous drones, which can be controlled by thought alone by a drone controller hundreds of thousands of miles away. And we're also seeing the beginning of developments of enhanced robotic war fighters, again made possible in some way by developments in neurotechnology. The same kind of developments that enable us to develop brain-driven prosthetics, neuro-driven prosthetics, arms, legs, hands that can grasp, that give people capacities who have lost limbs. And of course, this is a major issue in many military organizations, especially in the United States, in the aftermath of their many wars. We're already beginning to see these neurobiologically driven prosthetic limbs. But if you can drive a prosthetic limb by thought alone, you can drive an enhanced robotic warfighter by thought alone. So what's the battlefield of the future going to look like? Can we develop foresight to think through the battlefield of the future, to think what neurologically based technologies might contribute to that battlefield of the future, and then try and develop ways of thinking about how one might respond to the social and ethical challenges? Could you develop a robust and transparent governance system, for instance? Should you try and think about a Geneva Convention for the battlefield of the future? We have a lot of treaties on chemical and biological warfare and on chemical and biological weapons, and by and large, at least for states, we've limited, or up until very recent wars, we had limited, if not reduced altogether, the use of chemical and biological weapons in warfare. But what about robotic weapons? What about autonomous drones? What about neurobiologically based gases? We've seen these being used in Russia already. So is there a way of introducing equivalents of those kinds of treaties in relation to these neurotechnologies? What about robot ethics? We hear about robots being given ethics. We see these in our fictions, the 3 laws of robot ethics. Is that just fantasy, or is that reality? At the very least, we might think of educating robotic technologists in ethical considerations so that they can begin to think through what they mean for the design and regulation of, say, autonomous military systems. And this poses, of course, perhaps in the most fundamental way, the question of the responsibility of the researchers, taking us right back to how the researchers felt and responded, both during the Manhattan Project and after they saw the consequences of their actions. Now, we may think that that is just a fantasy. There's nothing that we can do to control those things. They are way, way beyond what's going on, what I'm doing in my research. I'm just doing very basic research in the lab. How can I be held responsible in any way whatsoever for how this might play out in the military? But it's not beyond consideration. So this is the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers developing or seeking to develop a code of conduct for ethical consideration of autonomous weapon systems. Now beginning to happen. That is another way. Think back to the Asilomar developments where the scientists themselves began to think about how they could anticipate and take responsibility for the consequences of the research that they were doing on recombinant DNA. Well, one sees an actual example here of how that's happening in the area of robotics. So there are a whole range of other issues that come up within these kinds of brain projects that I think are worthy of foresight, they're worthy of social and ethical consideration, and they're worthy of trying to build the kind of reflexivity into the researchers themselves that I've tried to talk about. Brain-computer interfaces, I've already mentioned the implications of those, whether or not we should read the mind, can read the mind, and as a consequence of reading the mind, reading out from the mind, be able to manipulate and modulate the brain. There is, of course, the long discussed question of animal experimentation in the brain project. I mentioned early on that the Japanese are doing work with marmosets, but the Chinese project thinks that one of its unique selling points, as it were, is its capacity, without stirring up a great deal of public discontent, to do work on non-human primates. Will that research on non-human primates feed into the research that others in countries that are not allowed to do research on these non-human primates? Will it feed into it? Should it be used? Should we be able to do genetic modification and transgenic work on higher primates in order to understand some of these absolutely devastating human diseases? What are the social and ethical consequences of doing those kinds of transgenic modifications? Of course, there are lots of questions about brain-like machines and simulation. What does it mean to simulate the human brain in a computer? Can you simulate a human brain in a human computer? In a computer, I mean, a human brain is in a body that develops from conception onwards in a world. First of all, the internal world of its mother, and then in the external world of its family. It's constantly suffused by inputs and outputs from the world outside. It's constantly in communication with other minds, with other humans. It can't live. It's evolved to be in that interactive, developmental situation. Can you ever simulate that in a computer? The emotions, the will, the intentionality. Ethical questions, philosophical questions, but also technical questions. And what does it mean if we start to think that the whole reality of the person is located within their brain? And finally, although I don't have any time to speak about it in detail now, we need to be realistic about the translational process from the lab into society. And again, there's been much research that's been done about this. The image of the translational process that's often believed is this linear image where things start in the bench and they move through a series of stages into applications here. But if you actually look at some of the ways in which in the past technological developments, in this case in pharmaceuticals, have tried to move from the bench to the bedside, you can see, without going into the details of this diagram, it's a horrendously complicated process, and it actually takes a very long time. dreams of being in the clinic 3 to 5 years after the basic research is done are, I'm afraid, just dreams, or at least the evidence that we have from previous research shows that the timelines are much, much longer, 10, 15, 17, 20 years. So we have to be very realistic about how long it takes for these very, very big hopes invested in these brain projects, how long it takes for those scientific developments actually to turn into things that are going to affect our world. This is not anti-science. In fact, from my point of view, lowering the expectations and being much more realistic about the expectations that funders and that members of the general public and other stakeholders have about that timescale. Lowering expectations, not hyping, but lowering the expectations and being more realistic about that is a way to enhance trust in science, because nothing is going to reduce trust in science than making very many highfalutin promises, 3 to 5 years in the lab, a cure for cancer, whatever it happens to be, and actually 3 to 5 years later, it turns out to be another 3 to 5 years, and another 3 to 5 years, and another 3 to 5 years. If we take our democratic citizens seriously, and if we debate these issues with them realistically, explain what we're doing, why we're doing, what risks there are, what timescales they are, and so on, to understand the nature of science in the real world, I think we will have a much greater chance of carrying our publics with us. All the evidence suggests that openness, collaboration, frankness, realism, engagement, that these are the way to make scientific development more robust and more supported, rather than to bring them into vulnerability. To be open about the problems, to be open about uncertainties, to be frank about the timescales, is not to reduce the willingness of our general population to invest in scientific research, but probably to increase it, to understand and engage with the realities of scientific research today in the real world. I think underlying the aspiration for responsible research and innovation is the wish to find a way of moving science towards this kind of vision. Thank you for your attention.